So now we're going to talk a bit about evolution, some basic concepts of evolution. And evolution is commonly depicted using what's called a phylogenetic tree or an evolutionary tree. And an evolutionary tree always has time as one axis and change as the other axis. And in this tree, they show here you have an organism, and it's changing over time at a certain rate. And then it reaches a point and one population splits into two different species, and each group changes in different ways from that point on. So anagenesis is the term that refers to change within, one species over time. So that if you look at the species at, this time point and you look back at the earlier time point, the species has changed, but it's still the same single species. And when you reach a split point, you have cladogenesis, is the creation of new clades or groups. And so cladogenesis is the splitting of one lineage into two. So the evolutionary tree has, just to use a scientific number, gazillions of splits of, different organisms into multiple subgroups. The way that species are defined typically relies on a couple of concepts in biology. One is called the biological species concept, and one's called the morphological species concept. But additionally, since we're in genetics, there's a genetic species concept, or called the phylogenetic species concept, where they do genetic comparisons of genomic DNA sequences and so on. But these are fundamentally, these are the two definitions that are the first that come at the top of the list. And the biological species concept states that a species is defined as a group of organisms, a population of organisms, that can interbreed with each other, and that want to interbreed with each other, and produce fertile, viable offspring. So you can use that definition for living organisms, things that are on Earth right now. You can observe and see if, two organisms breed and produce fertile, viable offspring. That means that they were part of the same species to start with. If they do not mate to produce fertile, viable offspring, then they're not the same species. And so the biological species concept is based on reproduction, if it can and will happen. And reproductive isolation is what keeps two species separate from each other. And so things that keep species separate from each other are called reproductive isolation mechanisms. You have mechanisms, things that keep the zygote from forming. It's called a prezygotic barrier, and things that can happen after a zygote forms that prevents it either from growing or from being fertile. So any one of these things can keep two groups from being part of the same species. It can keep them as separate. So the ecological barrier is when organisms live in different parts of the habitat and they just don't ever meet. Temporal barrier can include things like reproduction takes place at different times, maybe times of the year. Maybe you have one group that's fertile in the spring, one group that's fertile in the fall. So that's enough to keep the groups genetically separated. Mechanical barrier is when anatomical differences prevent successful copulation. That means the anatomy of the genitalia doesn't fit together to give you a successful mating. Behavioral barrier is typically in animals where differences in mating rituals prevent two organisms from trying to mate. And then one that's really strong is the gametic barrier, that the gametes are not compatible. So typically if you have two organisms that are clearly different species, like cat and dog, even if they tried to mate, which they don't, because they have different behavioral things and mechanical things, but even if they did, or even if you could convince them to do it, the egg and the sperm just wouldn't recognize each other and fuse. So there are biochemical things that the gametes require, pretty much receptors, that recognize the egg and the sperm recognize each other, and the fusion happens correctly. So gametic is a really important barrier. If there are some cases where two organisms that aren't the same species can fertilize and make a zygote, but one of these post-zygotic barriers comes into play. For example, the offspring of two different species is called a hybrid. Sometimes the hybrid just doesn't survive, it's weak, and even though the zygote forms, it doesn't grow or it doesn't survive. That's called hybrid inviability. One that you're probably familiar with is called hybrid sterility. It's where the hybrid actually isn't weak, it's reasonably strong, and it can grow, but when it grows up, it's not fertile. So a good example of that is, the mule, which is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse, or the liger, which is a hybrid of a lion and a tiger. These are viable hybrids, but not fertile. And then a really rare one is called hybrid breakdown, and I don't know of many examples of this, but it would be described as a case where the F1, the first hybrid, is viable and fertile, but the next generation is inviable or sterile. So those are all barriers that keep two groups from successfully mating, and that defines the two groups then as two separate species, according to the biological species concept. The morphological species concept is based on comparative anatomy. So you can use this concept for fossils. You look at the structure of the bones and the body, and an understanding of the anatomy, and you do comparative anatomy, and you group things based on similarities. That would be the morphological species concept. And so if you only have fossils, you're relying on that. Then you could also add in, DNA studies, so phylogenetic studies, to help your data. But it becomes, a lot more hypothetical if you're only working with fossils, of course. In evolution, we gather the data we have from the fossils to make our best hypothesis about how each part of the evolutionary process happened. Now, how does a new species form? You have two basic types of speciation. Speciation means formation of new species. And one type of speciation is called allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is any kind of speciation or formation of new species that happens because an original group gets separated physically by some kind of geographic barrier, such that they're kept apart long enough. So here is, I don't know if this is a mountain or a valley or what, but they're kept apart long enough that each group, through natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, all those things, genetically changes. And because some of those things are random, they'll change usually in different ways, and also adapt to their environments, which might be different. And that eventually, if they come back together, which here they call it secondary contact, then they may not be able to mate and interbreed and reproduce anymore, which means they are now separate species. So, for example, here they say that there's a prezygotic reproduction isolating mechanism. So one of those barriers now keeps them as separate species. This can take millions and millions of years. But there's an excellent video. In fact, I wonder if they didn't make this picture from your book based on this video, because there's an excellent example of this, which is shown in this PBS video. So I'm going to stop the lecture segment now and have you click the link below and watch this PBS video on a specific example of allopatric speciation.